AAA side of the industry continues to focus heavily on games revolving around the FPS and action genres, when they aren't doing the whole live services, that is. But for the indies, this year has so far been one for the strategy genre, with games like Medieval Kingdom Wars, AI War 2, and many others I am yet to cover, such as Legion, Ragtag, and John Schafer's At the Gates, just to name a very small few. It truly is one of the best years for the strategy gamer, and the game we're looking at today is one of the latest additions to that ever-increasing list. Precipice is a turn-based strategy game. It is developed and published by Little Red Dog Games, Inc., previously known for Deep Sixth and Rogue State. It released on Steam May 1st, 2019 for Windows, Linux and Steam OS, and is priced at €9.99. Precipice is an interesting concept, with the US and USSR essentially playing a game of nuclear chicken, and has deep strategic gameplay. But it is let down by repetitiveness, bland AI, little replay value, unrewarding gameplay and bugs, all of which badly affect the overall experience of the game. The objective of Precipice is to obtain 18 victory points or have a higher amount of victory points to that of your opposition by the end of 50 turns, in order to win the Cold War. Of course, that is if neither you nor your enemy decides to send the world into nuclear fallout. All it takes is for one to challenge the other and for neither to back down, and in the case of nuclear war, nobody wins. At the start of the game, you get to choose between 3 different scenarios. The first is a standard map where each side has a balanced amount of countries loyal to them. The second scenario is the land rush, where each side starts off with only their home country's loyalty and must attempt to persuade as many countries to join them as possible. The third scenario is one that is exclusive to the US and pits the player against a USSR controlled world, with the only country under US loyalty being the USA, and the player must attempt to claw their way back by gaining loyalty of the other countries from the USSR. The scenarios change up how a playthrough is played out, but overall doesn't change up the tactics required to win, so they each add a twist but don't make a huge difference to a playthrough. Each of the scenarios has a number of difficulty options to choose from, these difficulties being defensive, measured risk and aggressive. The difficulties change how the AI acts in a playthrough. In defensive, the opposing team tend to be less aggressive and less likely to challenge your moves by threatening a nuclear war. In measured risk, they are a bit more aggressive but tend to sum up the risk before being hasty with the nuclear launch button. And in aggressive, the AI just become a real warmonger and tend to force victory through declaring war as opposed to being diplomatic with other countries. This in return can make the push of the nuclear button a lot easier, as the enemy will be less likely to back down. The difficulties, much like the scenarios, don't change up a whole lot with a playthrough, just how aggressive or defensive the enemy is, resulting in really only affecting the likeliness of how easy the push of the nuke button is, which in return forces you to be more careful when picking a fight with the enemy's actions, as one wrong move will end it all. As for the gameplay itself, once you've decided on your scenario and what side you wish to play as, you get to choose 3 perks for the game. At the start, these perks will only include an increase in detection of clandestine activity in certain countries or stop the enemy from deploying spies to a specific country. Additional more powerful perks are unlocked for both the US and USSR by completing playthroughs, with each victory granting 1 new perk. The perks don't really add anything very much to the overall tactics of the gameplay. Some of the rare ones make things easier for you, such as lowering the amount of action points a specific action needs. But other than that, I've found them pretty useless in most cases. They also act as the only real means of replayability in Precipice 2, beyond each scenario and playing as each nation. The problem with Precipice and having the perks as their replay incentive is that their impact on the overall gameplay isn't deep enough that it makes the perks worthwhile unlocking. This results in any replay value the game has disappearing very quickly. Once you've chosen your perks, the game will begin. How it works is that you need to gain the loyalty of the various groups of countries throughout the world. There are 7 groups of countries, which are NATO, Warsaw Pact, Arab League, Sub-Saharan, South American, South Asia and East Asia. Each group has 2 sets of points, one being Unified Front, where you have all the countries loyal to you in that group, and the other is Majority, where most of the countries of the group are loyal to you. Unified Front grants the most victory points. With the more countries in a group, the more points a unity gives. For example, a unified NATO grants 4 victory points, while a unified South Asia gives 2 victory points, and a unified Sub-Saharan gives 7 victory points. While having a majority of countries loyal to you grants 2 points for NATO, 1 point for South Asia and 3 points for Sub-Saharan. Your goal is to gain loyalty with as many of the countries in each of these groups as possible. The first player to gain 18 victory points, or the player with the most points at the end of 50 turns, is the victor. The The point system and the groups of the countries is very well designed. The groups of the countries are shown on the screen to the left, showing which groups you have unified and majority points for, and which you don't. You can hover the cursor over any of the groups to highlight what countries belong to a group, to make it easy to identify what countries you need to work with. It really is well designed UI. There are a number of other means of gaining victory points throughout a playthrough other than just gaining the loyalty of the groups of countries. As you progress through a playthrough, one of a number of different world events will occur. These events occur for both the US and the USSR at the same time, and they must battle it out to complete them. The objective of these events is generally helping out a number of countries or by unifying countries such as East and West Germany or North and South Korea under one superpower. Additional victory points are then granted to the superpower who completes these events. The number of victory points given depending on the difficulty of it. Along with the world events, there is the space race between the two factions. You can invest money into the space program. Invest enough money and become the first to land on the moon, you will be granted an additional 2 victory points. The space race and the world events are designed to throw a spanner into the works to increase the intensity between the superpowers. The problem is, very often these instances end up in a stalemate, and neither side ends up completing them. The reason for this is they become more problematic than the actual value of the points is worth, and the time and action points spent trying to complete them can be used on something far more rewarding, and the events just end up left unfulfilled by the end of the game. As for the space race, it isn't really much of a race. Every single playthrough I've played, I've greatly outrun the opposition to landing on the moon. The eye of the opposing nation is always too busy with everything else, it tends to forget about the space side of things, only investing in it once in a blue moon. No pun intended. If anything, it has always acted as a very easy 2 victory points that often are what led to me being victorious over anything else. So while the events in Space Race are there to escalate things between the two powers, in reality they don't do anything to add to the gameplay. They are much like the perks system of the game. They exist with an intention in mind, but they don't impact the game in the way they are designed and intended to. So with all that out of the way, it's time to discuss how the actual game works. At the start of each turn, each of the 2 nations will have 5 action points. These action points can be used to form trade agreements, start diplomatic discussions, invade, invest money, start a protest, or send a spy to destabilize a country. We'll start with the trade agreements. As you progress through the game, you can form trade agreements with various countries where you give them a particular resource in exchange for another. If your trade agreement withstands for 8 turns, that country will become loyal to you as long as they are not 100% loyal to the enemy or become unstable. It is a slow but safe way of forming loyalty with countries. As far as the mechanics workings go, it is fully functional and works very well, but it isn't very well explained in the tutorial or in the game guide. It is confusing as to how many trade agreements you can have going at any one time, as it is never explained. Along with that, I found at the start of a playthrough on the first turn you can only set up 1 trade agreement, and only in the second turn can you set up a second trade agreement. But it is something that is never properly explained in any way, so I cannot tell if it's a bug or that the rules of the mechanics simply hasn't been explained to the player properly. Is a problem that doesn't affect the use of the trade agreements to any major degree, but does leave you somewhat bewildered on getting them set up. When looking for a more peaceful method of getting a country on your side, you can use diplomacy. Diplomacy is really only effective when used with a country that is neutral or partially loyal to you. The more loyal a country is to the enemy, the lower the chance of success is. Each use of diplomacy requires an action point. In order to gain loyalty through diplomacy, you need to have 4 successful attempts that is shown using the ring around the diplomacy logo. For each successful diplomatic attempt, the ring will fill 1/4 of the way with green. Once filled, the country will become more loyal to you, but with each failed attempt, it will push your successful attempts back by 1. The diplomacy of the game is effective in that it keeps the general fast pace of the game moving, but the RNG of the success rate can at times feel like it's going against the odds. Along with that, it isn't a very deep mechanic considering it is diplomacy. I understand that it's designed this way to keep the pace of the game moving, but it would really benefit from having a system where the player has some form of impact on the success rate as opposed to it just being nothing but a percentage chance. Right now it works, but its RNG based success rate is a bit bland. A country's stability is shown by the dots that are present in the middle of it, with there being a maximum of 4. The less stable a country is, the easier it is to take over using a more forceful means. There are 2 ways of lowering a country's stability. The first is to fuel protests. This can only be used in a country with full stability of 4 and lowers it to 3. To further lower the stability, you will need to deploy a spy to the country and fund an insurgency. Like with the diplomacy, the success rate of funding an insurgency is based on a percentage chance. The lower the stability of a country, the higher the chance of success of insurgency. Occasionally this action may cause a brush fire which can lower the stability of another random country, but it is something that doesn't happen all that often. Each time you do this, there is a chance of your spy being detected by the enemy. If they find out where your spy is, they will counter-spy during their turn if you don't move them by the end of yours. This will result in your spy being killed, but we'll go into spies in more detail shortly. Once a country is destabilized, it makes actions like invading and initiating a coup easier. In the case of invading, the country's forces will be lower, making it easier to conquer with fewer forces needed. But beware, the more you invade countries, the more uneasy your home country will become and riots will break out. The reason for this is because the people of the country think your warmonger actions will be the cause of a nuclear war. Riots can then result in you being overthrown and put out of power, which will result in the end of the game. A coup is very different in that it is a powerful but expensive move where, if successful, a country immediately becomes loyal to you. But it can equally go just as backwards on you too. If a coup fails, it can sometimes turn the country's loyalty to your enemy instead, as they find out you are helping the rebels to overthrow the regiment. The success rate of a coup is determined by the level of the country's stability, along with how many adjacent countries to it are loyal to you and loyal to your enemy. With each country that is loyal to you, you gain a 10% boost, while with countries loyal to the enemy, you gain a 10% decrease in the success chance. You can increase the stability of one of your countries by investing money into it. Again, the success rate being a certain percentage depending on how stable the country is. The higher the stability, the less likely the chance of success is. The whole stability and destabilizing of a country is the deepest strategic mechanic in the whole game. It works extremely well, as you need to choose when you destabilize a country and how much effort it will take to conquer and turn it to your side, while taking the many other factors into account. For example, do you spend money destabilizing a country and then invade it, and if so, do you have the action points and troops to do that successfully? Or if you decide to go with the coup, do you have enough loyal countries adjacent to it that the success rate is worth the investment? All the while making sure to keep the stability of those loyal to you high to make it harder for the enemy to take over. It is a great strategy and easily the best part of the entire game. Then there is the spies. Each side has 3 spies available to them at the start of the game. The spies are what grant you actions like funding insurgencies and coups. Without them, you will not be able to do either, and both are very important options that make a huge difference in your campaign. But your enemy is just as likely to use their spies to their advantage too. You can infiltrate the enemy's headquarters and find what region or regions any of the enemy's spies may currently be residing. From here you can attempt to figure out what country they are in and counter-spy. If you use counter-spy on the country the enemy spy resides in, you will assassinate them. Killing a spy is permanent, so aiming to kill the enemy's 3 spies is important and will really restrict them in what they can do. But remember, the enemy can do exactly the same to you. The spies add another layer to the strategy of the game and act as a real game changer. It makes eliminating the enemies a priority while also keeping yours from being found by the enemy. The problem with the spies is that it is too easy to avoid the enemy finding yours. You simply send your spy in, do what needs to be done, and then can withdraw them back to headquarters without the need of any additional action points. Do this and the enemy can't ever catch up with your spy, while the enemy on the other hand tends to keep their spies scattered and within countries, making it easy to find and kill them. The spy mechanic is one that works from the perspective of adding another layer of strategy to the game, but is poorly executed and easy to abuse, and if playing against another player, it could be possible that neither side ever loses a spy, which takes away the interesting risk factor that comes with using them, overall lessening the mechanic greatly. Finally is the conflicts of action. Throughout the game, as you perform specific actions such as invading a country, a coup, and stationing troops in a country, the enemy may very well challenge you, in hopes of persuading you to back down in your action. This is where the main selling point of playing a game of nuclear chicken comes into play. When your actions are challenged, the enemy will bring your actions to the UN, where you can make the decision of standing by your action or backing down. Each time you stand by your action, there is a chance of the enemy refusing to back down. Sometimes they will, and other times they will continue to challenge you. Do this enough times, you will be given the choice to press the big red button causing nuclear warfare, ultimately ending the game as a draw, or you can back down. Of course you can do the same with the enemy, where you can challenge them for their actions, but just like with you, push them too far and they may very well press the nuclear button themselves. There are however other problems with challenging and backing down in these circumstances. If you challenge the enemy too much, some countries may think you're taking things too far and are running the risk of nuclear war and lower their loyalty with you, while backing down on a challenge can cause countries to lower their loyalty due to seeing you as weak for backing down. So if challenged by the enemy, or if you challenge the enemy themselves, you run the risk of lowering all that hard-earned loyalty with certain countries. What countries are affected by this is completely random. The game of chicken, shall we say, is Precipice's biggest selling point, but it is also one of the most poorly executed. It is extremely frustrating to have all your hard work gaining loyalty with countries destroyed because of either feeling you have to challenge the enemy or by being challenged by them. I understand that the idea behind this is probably that nobody wins with war, and that is fine to have, but it doesn't work from a gameplay perspective. It ends up with pretty much both sides ending up losing their hard-earned victory points and ending up in a draw, and the victor, as previously mentioned, is generally decided by the space race and any fulfilled world events. It is most of the time better to simply avoid challenges as much as possible as opposed to looking for them, and in return it doesn't make for compelling strategy gameplay. On top of that, the whole system is very basic, where the player is given only two options. I would have liked to see more of a negotiation system put into place for this mechanic, where the two countries could attempt to talk it out and maybe make some sort of agreement as opposed to just yes, no or boom. It needs something to make it a bit more interesting and far less frustrating. Along with the single player, there is also a multiplayer mode, but unfortunately I cannot comment on that, as I couldn't so much as get a game going, as there was simply none there. But according to Steam forums for the game, there have been problems with the multiplayer side of things, even when two friends attempt to join up against each other, so that could have something to do with the lack of players. So right now it seems single player is the only sure way of actually playing the game. Overall, Precipice is an interesting concept, and I love how each of the countries has their animal representing them as opposed to it being human. It adds a real charm to the game, and the UI is very well designed. But the problem lays with its gameplay, which while it has some strategic depth, it isn't very well executed. The gameplay is repetitive, the AI of opponents is bland and predictable on each of the difficulty settings. Some of the mechanics are poorly explained and easily abused. The game's biggest selling point of a nuclear game of chicken is unrewarding and frustrating. There are some minor bugs running through the game too, such as the UI icons disappearing, and some of the mechanics are quite imbalanced here and there. Precipice has all the ingredients to provide exciting and excellent gameplay, but right now it has a long way to go before it even gets close to that. If there is one thing that Precipice does extremely well, it is the atmosphere of the game. There are a number of tracks to play throughout the game, each very distinctive from the other, but all have one thing in common: urgency. They each bring to life that sense of disruption to the balance of the world, and that chaos is just around each and every corner, where all it will take is one wrong move for a massive conflict to begin. It has strong military tones matched in with big bold notes to symbolise the power of the two conflicting nations too, and when combined together brings the world and theme of Precipice to a whole new level. Precipice is one of those games that has a real charm to it, where you just can't hate it despite all of its problems. It has some great strategic depth to it, with great UI and plenty of options and choices of actions to make at your disposal. But the execution of those actions and the bland AI, along with the rewards and impact they have on the game, is minimal and unsatisfactory. Not to mention a multiplayer that doesn't appear to work. In the long run it becomes repetitive, frustrating, and it doesn't feel like it is time well spent. And with that, I give Precipice a 3 out of 10. Precipice is a game that has had a ton of love and passion put into it, and it certainly has its good points and its charm. But the reality of it is 2019 is quickly becoming the year for the indie strategy games, and Precipice is unfortunately one that is on the lower end of that list.